Hey friends, tonight we step onto a ship that needs no introduction, not for its luxury, not for its speed, but for its silence, the silence beneath the waves where it now rests. The RMS Titanic was a marvel of engineering, a floating palace, but it took only a few hours for dreams to freeze, metal to bend, and legends to sink. So settle in, dim the lights, and join me as we slowly drift back to 1912. A quiet night, a cold sea, and a ship thought to be unsinkable. Close your eyes and let your mind drift backward through time, past the noise and rush of our modern world, past the countless ships that have sailed these waters since, back to a quieter era when the ocean still held mysteries that seemed unconquerable. We're traveling back to April of 1912, to a time when the future felt bright and progress seemed limitless, when humanity believed it could master the very forces of nature itself. The story we're about to explore together isn't just about a ship, it's about dreams made of steel and rivets, about the quiet confidence of an age that believed in its own invincibility. The Titanic wasn't merely a vessel, it was a symbol of everything the early 20th century thought it could achieve. It represented the marriage of luxury and technology, the promise that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle nature might place in its path. Tonight, we'll walk the decks of this magnificent ship, not as it lies broken on the ocean floor, but as it once sailed proudly through the Atlantic, its lights blazing against the darkness, its engines humming with purposeful power. We'll meet the people who built her, who sailed on her, who believed in her promise of safety and luxury. We'll explore the quiet moments before the chaos, the ordinary evening that became extraordinary in ways no one could have imagined. The Titanic's story unfolds like a gentle tide, starting with ambition and hope, flowing through confidence and celebration, then slowly, inevitably, turning toward that cold April night when the impossible became reality. But even in tragedy, there are moments of quiet heroism, of human dignity preserved in the face of unimaginable circumstances. These are the stories that linger in the darkness, the voices that still whisper across the waves. As we begin this journey together, imagine yourself standing on the docks of Southampton, watching this magnificent ship prepare for her maiden voyage. Feel the cool English morning air against your skin, hear the gentle lapping of water against the hull, sense the quiet excitement of passengers and crew as they prepare to embark on what they believed would be a routine crossing to New York. No one standing there that morning could have imagined that they were witnessing the beginning of one of history's most enduring tragedies. The Titanic was born from an era of remarkable optimism, a time when engineers and designers pushed the boundaries of what was possible, when luxury and safety were not seen as competing interests, but as complementary goals. The ship represented the pinnacle of Edwardian confidence, a floating testament to human achievement that would carry its passengers not just across the ocean, but into a future that seemed bright with promise. But the ocean, as we know, keeps its own counsel. The Atlantic that April was cold and still, deceptively calm on the surface while hiding dangers that would test every assumption about progress and invincibility. The waters that would soon claim the Titanic had been waiting, patient and eternal, for this moment when human ambition would meet the immutable forces of nature. Tonight we'll explore how this magnificent ship came to be, how she was built with such care and attention to detail, how she embodied the dreams and aspirations of an entire age. We'll walk through her corridors, visit her dining rooms, and understand what made her passengers and crew so confident in her abilities. We'll discover the quiet details that made the Titanic not just a ship, but a floating world complete with its own society, its own rhythms, its own sense of purpose. The story of the Titanic is ultimately a human story, filled with real people who had real dreams, real hopes, real fears. It's about the wireless operator who stayed at his post, the musicians who played until the very end, the passengers who faced the impossible with quiet dignity. It's about the builders who crafted each rivet with pride, the designers who dreamed of creating something that would last forever, the crew members who took pride in serving aboard what they considered the finest ship ever built. As we settle into this story together, let the modern world fade away. Let go of the urgency and noise of today, and allow yourself to drift back to that quieter time when the future seemed certain and progress appeared unstoppable. We're going to explore the Titanic, not as a symbol of disaster, but as a monument to human ambition, a testament to the dreams that drove an entire generation to reach for something greater than themselves. The ocean tonight is calm, just as it was on that April evening in 1912. The stars are bright overhead, reflecting off the dark water in patterns that have remained unchanged for millennia. Somewhere far below, the Titanic rests in peaceful silence, her story preserved in the eternal darkness of the deep. But up here, in the gentle rhythm of our breathing, in the quiet space between sleeping and waking, her story continues to unfold, as relevant and moving today as it was over a century ago. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders relax, and prepare to step aboard the RMS Titanic. Not the broken ship of tragedy, but the proud vessel of dreams, the floating palace that once carried the hopes of so many people across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. Tonight, we sail together into history, guided by the gentle currents of memory and the timeless pull of human stories that refuse to be forgotten. Lash Chapter 1, The Dream of Titanic, gentle contemplative tone throughout. As we settle into our journey through the story of the Titanic, let us begin not with the cold waters of the North Atlantic, but with the warm glow of ambition that first sparked this magnificent vessel into existence. The story of the Titanic begins long before her keel was laid, long before her name was chosen, in the quiet boardrooms and busy shipyards of an age that believed deeply in the power of human achievement to conquer the natural world. Picture, if you will, the world of the early 1900s, a time when the ocean was not merely a barrier between continents, but a highway of dreams and possibilities. This was the golden age of ocean liners, when crossing the Atlantic was not just a means of transportation, but an experience unto itself, a floating celebration of luxury, technology, and human ingenuity. The great ships of this era were more than vessels. They were floating palaces, mobile cities that carried their passengers not just across the ocean, but into a world of elegance and refinement that seemed to exist nowhere else on Earth. Harsh, the golden age of ocean liners. In the peaceful quiet of the early 20th century, when the world moved at a gentler pace and luxury was measured not in speed but in comfort, the ocean liner represented the pinnacle of civilized travel. These magnificent ships were the product of an age that valued craftsmanship, attention to detail, and the quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful and lasting. The competition between the great shipping lines was not merely about who could carry the most passengers or cargo, but about who could create the most elegant, the most comfortable, the most impressive floating experience. The ocean liners of this era were designed with a philosophy that seems almost quaint by modern standards. Every detail was considered, every surface was crafted with care, every passenger was treated as a welcome guest in a floating hotel that happened to be crossing the ocean. The dining rooms were graced with crystal chandeliers and mahogany paneling, the staterooms were furnished with the finest materials available, and the public spaces were designed to rival the most elegant hotels on land. Imagine stepping aboard one of these magnificent vessels in the early 1900s. The gangway would be lined with uniformed crew members, their brass buttons gleaming in the afternoon sun, their faces bearing the quiet pride of those who served aboard the finest ships in the world. The first glimpse of the ship's interior would reveal a world of polished wood and gleaming brass, of thick carpets and comfortable furniture, of spaces designed to make passengers forget they were at sea at all. The great ocean liners were floating communities, complete with their own social hierarchies, their own rhythms, their own sense of purpose. Passengers would dress for dinner each evening, gathering in grand dining rooms, where the conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, where the gentle motion of the ship provided a soothing backdrop to the evening's entertainment. The days would pass in a comfortable routine of meals, promenades on deck, games in the lounge, and quiet moments watching the endless expanse of ocean roll by. These ships represented more than just transportation. They embodied the optimism and confidence of an age that believed in progress, in the power of human ingenuity to create something better than what had come before. Each new liner was larger than the last, more luxurious, more technologically advanced, more capable of providing its passengers with an experience that would linger in their memories long after they had returned to solid ground. The competition between shipping lines was fierce but genteel, conducted with the same quiet dignity that characterized the ships themselves. Each company sought to outdo the others, not through loud advertising or aggressive marketing, but through the simple expedient of building ships that were more beautiful, more comfortable, more impressive than anything their competitors could offer. This was a time when reputation mattered more than profit margins, when the goal was not just to transport passengers, but to provide them with an experience worthy of the finest traditions of hospitality and service. Hash. The visionary behind the dream, J.P. Morgan and the White Star Line. Into this world of elegant competition stepped one of the most powerful financial minds of the age, a man whose vision would reshape the very nature of ocean travel and whose ambitions would ultimately give birth to the Titanic herself. John Pierpont Morgan, known to the world as J.P. Morgan, was a financier of extraordinary capability and vision, a man who saw opportunities where others saw only obstacles, who understood that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. Morgan's interest in ocean liners was not merely financial, it was strategic and deeply personal. He understood that control of the Atlantic shipping lanes meant control of the flow of people, goods and ideas between Europe and America. In an age when the ocean was still the primary highway between continents, the man who controlled the ships controlled the very arteries of international commerce and communication. The White Star Line, when it came into Morgan's sphere of influence, was already a respected name in Atlantic shipping, but it was Morgan's vision that would transform it into something truly extraordinary. He saw the potential for ships that would not merely compete with their rivals, but would render them obsolete through sheer magnificence and technological superiority. Under his guidance, the White Star Line would embark on an ambitious program of shipbuilding that would culminate in the creation of 3 sister ships, each one larger and more luxurious than anything that had come before. Morgan's approach to business was characterized by the same quiet confidence that marked the great ocean liners themselves. He was not given to dramatic gestures or loud pronouncements, but rather to careful planning, meticulous attention to detail, and the patient accumulation of resources and expertise necessary to achieve his goals. When he decided that the White Star Line should build the largest and most luxurious ships in the world, he set about making it happen with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized all his business ventures. The financial resources at Morgan's disposal were vast, but more important than his wealth was his understanding of what the traveling public wanted. He recognized that passengers were not merely seeking transportation from one port to another, they were seeking an experience, a brief escape from the ordinary world, into a realm of luxury and refinement that would provide them with memories to last a lifetime. This understanding would guide every decision made in the design and construction of the ships that would bear the White Star Line's name. Under Morgan's guidance, the White Star Line developed a philosophy of service that went far beyond simply providing passage across the Atlantic. They sought to create floating palaces that would rival the finest hotels on land, ships that would be destinations in themselves rather than merely means of reaching a destination. This philosophy would inform every aspect of the Titanic's design, from the grand staircase that would become her most iconic feature to the smallest details of her passenger accommodations. Morgan's influence extended beyond mere financial backing. He was intimately involved in the planning and design process, ensuring that every element of the new ships would meet his exacting standards for luxury and elegance. He understood that in an age of increasing competition, success would go to those who could provide not just transportation but transformation, not just passage, but an experience that would elevate their passengers above the ordinary concerns of daily life. The decision to build 3 sister ships rather than focusing on a single vessel was typical of Morgan's strategic thinking. He understood that true dominance in the Atlantic shipping lanes would require not just one exceptional ship but a fleet of vessels that could maintain regular service while setting new standards for luxury and comfort. The Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic would each represent the pinnacle of naval architecture and interior design, but together they would form a triumvirate of luxury that would establish the White Star Line as the undisputed leader in transatlantic travel. The Craftsman's Cathedral, Harland and Wolff's Belfast Shipyard. The dreams and ambitions of J.P. Morgan and the White Star Line would mean nothing without the skilled hands and keen minds necessary to transform vision into reality. For this crucial task, they turned to one of the most respected shipbuilding firms in the world, a company whose reputation for quality and attention to detail matched perfectly with the ambitions of those who sought to create the finest ships ever built. Harland and Wolff, based in Belfast, Ireland, was more than just a shipbuilding company. It was an institution, a place where the ancient craft of shipbuilding had been elevated to the level of art. The shipyard, situated on the banks of the River Lagan, was a sprawling complex of workshops, dry docks and construction facilities that represented the pinnacle of early 20th century industrial capability. Here, in the cool, damp air of Ulster, some of the most magnificent ships ever created would take shape under the skilled hands of craftsmen who took as much pride in their work as any artist ever took in a masterpiece. The relationship between Harland and Wolff and the White Star Line was one of mutual respect and shared vision. The shipbuilders understood that they were not merely constructing vessels, but creating floating works of art that would carry the reputation of both companies across the world's oceans. Every rivet, every plate of steel, every piece of decorative woodwork was crafted with the knowledge that it would be judged not just by engineers and naval architects, but by the traveling public, who would measure the success of these ships, not just by their speed or safety, but by their ability to provide an experience worthy of the finest traditions of luxury and hospitality. Walking through the Harland and Wolff shipyard in the early 1900s would have been like entering a cathedral of industry, a place where the noise of hammers and the hiss of steam created a symphony of creation. The massive dry docks where the ships would take shape were engineering marvels in themselves, concrete and steel structures capable of supporting vessels of unprecedented size and weight. The workshops where the interior fittings would be crafted were filled with the finest woods, the most skilled carpenters, and the most experienced craftsmen available anywhere in the world. The men who worked at Harland and Wolff were not merely laborers but artisans, each one contributing his particular skill to the creation of something that would outlast them all. The riveters who would join the massive steel plates together worked with a precision that bordered on the mystical, their hammers keeping time like a great industrial heartbeat. The carpenters who would craft the elegant interiors brought with them generations of knowledge about working with wood, about creating spaces that would be both beautiful and functional even in the challenging environment of an ocean-going vessel. The planning and design process at Harland and Wolff was meticulous and thorough, involving not just the technical aspects of shipbuilding, but the aesthetic and practical considerations that would make the finished vessels truly exceptional. The naval architects who would design the ship's hulls worked closely with interior designers who would create the passenger accommodations, ensuring that every element of the ships would work together to create a harmonious whole that would exceed the expectations of even the most demanding passengers. The construction of each ship was a lengthy process that required not just skilled labor, but careful coordination of hundreds of different tasks and trades. The steel plates that would form the hull had to be cut and shaped with precision, then joined together with a strength and integrity that would withstand the enormous stresses of ocean travel. The engines that would power the ships were marvels of engineering in themselves, massive constructions of steel and brass that would provide the reliable power necessary to maintain schedules across the unpredictable Atlantic. The attention to detail that characterized the work at Harland and Wolff extended to every aspect of the ship's construction, from the massive anchor chains that would hold the vessels secure in port to the delicate crystal fixtures that would grace their most elegant public spaces. The craftsmen who worked on these ships understood that they were creating something special, something that would carry the reputation of their firm and their skills to every port in the world. A ship called Titanic, symbol of modern pride, from the convergence of Morgan's vision, the White Star Line's ambitions, and Harland and Wolff's craftsmanship would emerge a ship that would embody all the hopes and dreams of an age that believed deeply in the power of human achievement. The name Titanic was chosen not merely for its grandeur, but for its symbolism, representing the titanic efforts of all those who had contributed to her creation and the titanic ambitions of those who would sail upon her. The Titanic was conceived as more than just a ship. She was designed to be a floating symbol of human progress, a testament to what could be achieved when vision, resources, and skill were combined in pursuit of a common goal. Every aspect of her design reflected the confidence of an age that believed in its ability to conquer the natural world, to create something that would stand as a monument to human ingenuity and determination. The very scale of the Titanic was unprecedented, dwarfing even the largest ships that had come before her. At 882 feet in length and 175 feet in height, she was a structure that would have been impressive even on land. But the fact that this massive construction was designed to float and move across the ocean with grace and elegance made her achievement all the more remarkable. The statistics that described her capabilities were staggering. She could carry over 2,400 passengers and crew, her engines could generate 30,000 horsepower, and her top speed would exceed 23 knots. But the Titanic's true significance lay not in her size or speed, but in what she represented about the age that created her. She embodied the optimism of an era that believed in progress, the confidence of a generation that saw no limits to what human ingenuity could achieve. Her designers and builders approached their task with the assumption that they were creating something that would last for decades, perhaps centuries, carrying passengers across the Atlantic in comfort and safety, long after they themselves had passed from the scene. The interior design of the Titanic reflected the same confidence and ambition that characterized her construction. The grand staircase that would become her most famous feature was designed to rival the finest architectural achievements of the age, a sweeping construction of oak and glass that would serve as the centerpiece of the ship's first-class accommodations. The dining rooms were planned to accommodate hundreds of passengers in surroundings that would match the finest restaurants on land, while the passenger cabins were designed to provide levels of comfort and luxury that would exceed what many travelers could expect to find in their own homes. The technological innovations incorporated into the Titanic's design were remarkable even by the standards of an age that prided itself on technological advancement. Her hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, leading to the confident assertion that she was practically unsinkable. Her electrical systems were more advanced than those found in many buildings on land, providing power for lighting, heating, and the operation of elevators that would carry passengers between decks. Her communication equipment included the latest in wireless technology, ensuring that she would remain in contact with the outside world throughout her voyages. The pride that surrounded the Titanic's construction was evident in every aspect of her design and construction. The craftsmen who worked on her understood that they were creating something special, something that would carry their reputation and their skills to every corner of the world. The investors who financed her construction saw her as a symbol of their vision and ambition, a tangible representation of what could be achieved when resources and determination were combined in pursuit of excellence. The Titanic represented the culmination of decades of development in ocean liner design and construction. She incorporated the lessons learned from every ship that had come before her, while introducing innovations that would influence ship design for generations to come. Her designers approached their task with the confidence of those who believed they were creating something that would define the future of ocean travel, a ship that would set new standards for safety, comfort, and elegance that others would strive to match. The dream made manifest. As we reach the conclusion of this first chapter in the Titanic story, we find ourselves contemplating the remarkable convergence of vision, ambition, and skill that brought this magnificent vessel into existence. The Titanic was not merely a ship, but a dream made manifest, a tangible representation of an age's confidence in its ability to achieve the impossible and create something that would stand as a lasting monument to human ingenuity. The world that created the Titanic was one of quiet confidence and measured ambition, where progress was seen not as a frantic rush toward an uncertain future, but as a steady, methodical advance toward a better tomorrow. The men who conceived and built this ship approached approached their task with the patience and attention to detail that characterized the best achievements of their age, understanding that true excellence could not be hurried, but must be carefully crafted over time. The story of the Titanic's creation is ultimately a story about dreams and the power of human determination to transform vision into reality. From J.P. Morgan's financial backing to the skilled hands of the craftsmen at Harland and Wolff, every person who contributed to the ship's construction was part of a larger effort to create something that would exceed all expectations and establish new standards for what was possible in ocean travel. As we prepare to follow the Titanic from her construction through her brief but memorable career, we carry with us an understanding of the hopes and dreams that brought her into existence. She was born from an age that believed in progress, crafted by hands that took pride in their work, and launched with the confidence of those who saw no limits to what human ingenuity could achieve. The Titanic's story is our story, a reflection of humanity's eternal desire to reach beyond the possible and create something that will outlast our own brief time on Earth. In the quiet moments between sleeping and waking, as we drift through the history of this magnificent ship, we can hear the echoes of the dreams that created her, the ambitions that drove her construction, and the pride that launched her on her fateful journey across the Atlantic. The dream of the Titanic was born in the quiet confidence of an age that believed in its ability to conquer the natural world, to create something beautiful and lasting that would carry its passengers not just across the ocean, but into a future bright with promise. That dream, crafted in steel and wood, decorated with the finest materials available, and launched with the hopes of all who contributed to her creation, would soon take its place among the most magnificent ships ever to grace the world's oceans. In the gentle rhythm of waves against a distant shore, in the quiet confidence of skilled hands shaping raw materials into something beautiful, in the patient accumulation of resources and expertise necessary to achieve the impossible, the Titanic was born. She was a dream made real, a symbol of human ambition and achievement that would soon carry her passengers into history, into legend, and into the eternal memory of all who continue to be inspired by the story of her brief but remarkable journey across the Atlantic. Chapter 2. Inside the floating palace, gentle, contemplative tone throughout. As we step through the polished brass doors of the Titanic and enter her magnificent interior, we find ourselves transported into a world that exists somewhere between dream and reality, a floating palace that defied every expectation of what a ship could be. The Titanic was not merely a vessel designed to carry passengers across the Atlantic. She was a carefully crafted environment where every detail had been considered, every surface designed to create an atmosphere of luxury and comfort that would rival the finest hotels and palaces on land. The interior of the Titanic represented the culmination of decades of innovation in ocean liner design, but more than that, it reflected the social hierarchies and cultural assumptions of Edwardian society. As we wander through her corridors and public spaces, we can see how the ship's designers created not just one floating world, but several distinct environments, each tailored to the expectations and means of different classes of passengers. The Titanic was a microcosm of the world that created her, complete with its own social stratification, its own customs, and its own unspoken rules about who belonged where. Let us begin our gentle exploration of this floating palace by ascending to the most luxurious accommodations the ship had to offer, before slowly making our way through the various levels of comfort and privilege that defined life aboard the Titanic. As we move through these spaces, we can imagine the soft footfalls of passengers walking these same corridors, the gentle murmur of conversation in the public rooms, and the quiet satisfaction of those who found themselves surrounded by such unprecedented luxury at sea. The realm of first-class luxury. The first-class accommodations aboard the Titanic represented the absolute pinnacle of maritime luxury, spaces designed to make their occupants forget entirely that they were aboard a ship in the middle of the ocean. These were not merely hotel rooms adapted for sea travel, but carefully crafted environments that surpassed in comfort and elegance many of the finest establishments on land. The designers understood that their first-class passengers were accustomed to the very best that money could buy, and they set out to create accommodations that would exceed even the most demanding expectations. The first-class suites were marvels of space and comfort, rooms that seemed to expand beyond the physical constraints of the ship itself. The largest of these accommodations, the promenade suites, featured private covered walkways that allowed their occupants to stroll outside their rooms while remaining protected from the elements. These suites included separate bedrooms, sitting rooms, and private bathrooms, furnished with the finest materials available and decorated in a variety of period styles that reflected the diverse tastes of the wealthy passengers who would occupy them. Walking into one of these first-class suites would have been like entering a world of quiet luxury that seemed to exist independent of the ship that contained it. The walls were paneled in rich woods, carefully selected and expertly crafted to create an atmosphere of warmth and sophistication. The furniture was upholstered in the finest fabrics, chosen not just for their beauty, but for their durability and comfort during the long Atlantic crossing. The beds were fitted with the softest linens, the windows were dressed with elegant curtains, and every surface was decorated with objects that spoke of quality and refinement. The private bathrooms in the first-class suites were particularly remarkable, featuring running water, electric lighting, and fixtures that would have been considered luxurious even in the finest homes on land. The bathtubs were large enough to provide a truly relaxing experience, while the marble-topped washstands and gilt-framed mirrors created an atmosphere of pampered indulgence. These were spaces where passengers could maintain their accustomed routines of personal care and grooming, surrounded by amenities that made the shipboard experience feel like an extension of their privileged lives on shore. The first-class dining room was perhaps the most impressive public space aboard the Titanic, a vast chamber that could accommodate over 550 passengers in surroundings that rivaled the finest restaurants in London or New York. The room was designed in the Jacobean style, with rich oak paneling and elegant plasterwork that created an atmosphere of timeless sophistication. The tables were set with the finest china, crystal and silver, while the chairs were upholstered in luxurious fabrics that invited long leisurely meals in the company of fellow passengers. Dining in the first-class restaurant was not merely about consuming food, but about participating in a social ritual that reinforced the passengers' sense of belonging to a privileged class. The meals were elaborate affairs, with multiple courses prepared by skilled chefs who had been recruited from the finest hotels and restaurants in Europe. The service was impeccable, provided by trained stewards who understood that their role was not just to serve food, but to create an atmosphere of refined hospitality that would make every passenger feel like an honored guest. The first-class passengers also had access to a variety of other amenities that were designed to make their journey as comfortable and enjoyable as possible. The first-class lounge was a spacious, elegantly appointed room where passengers could relax with a book, engage in conversation with fellow travelers, or simply enjoy the quiet pleasure of being surrounded by beautiful objects and comfortable furnishings. The room was decorated with fine art and furnished with comfortable chairs and sofas that invited long hours of peaceful contemplation. Perhaps most remarkable of all was the first-class swimming pool, a technological marvel that seemed to defy the very concept of being at sea. The pool was filled with heated seawater and surrounded by changing rooms and shower facilities that would have been impressive even in the finest athletic clubs on land. The idea that passengers could enjoy a refreshing swim while crossing the Atlantic was a testament to the ship's designer's commitment to providing every possible luxury and comfort. The Turkish baths represented another extraordinary amenity available to first-class passengers, a facility that transported them into an exotic world of relaxation and rejuvenation. These elaborate facilities included steam rooms, cooling chambers, and massage rooms, all decorated in an Orientalist style that evoked the luxury of Eastern palaces. The Turkish baths were staffed by skilled attendants who provided a range of services designed to refresh and revitalize passengers who might be feeling the effects of the ocean crossing. The grand staircase and mechanical marvels. At the heart of the Titanic's first-class accommodations stood perhaps the most iconic feature of the entire ship, the grand staircase, a magnificent construction that served not just as a means of moving between decks, but as a symbol of the ship's grandeur and the social aspirations of those who traveled upon her. This remarkable structure was more than just a staircase. It was a work of art, a focal point that drew the eye and the imagination upward toward the elegant dome that crowned this architectural masterpiece. The grand staircase was constructed of solid English oak, carved and polished to a lustrous finish that seemed to glow in the light of the elaborate crystal chandelier that hung from the center of the ornate dome above. The craftsmanship, evident in every detail of the staircase, was extraordinary, from the intricate newel posts that anchored each landing to the elaborate carved panels that decorated the walls. The designers understood that this space would be the first impression many passengers would have of the ship's interior, and they spared no expense in creating something that would take the breath away. The staircase descended through multiple decks, connecting the various levels of first-class accommodations and public spaces with a grace and elegance that made the simple act of moving from one floor to another feel like a ceremonial procession. The wide, sweeping steps were carpeted with rich fabric that muffled the sound of footsteps, while the polished brass handrails provided both practical support and aesthetic pleasure. The entire structure was designed to accommodate the formal dress and dignified bearing of the first-class passengers, providing them with a stage worthy of their social status. The dome that crowned the grand staircase was a marvel of engineering and artistry, featuring an elaborate glass ceiling that allowed natural light to filter down through the stairwell during the day, while protecting the space from the elements. The glass panels were set in an intricate iron framework that created patterns of light and shadow that changed throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky. At night, the dome was illuminated by electric lighting that created a warm, welcoming glow that drew passengers to this central gathering place. The grand staircase was not just a means of transportation, but a social space where passengers would encounter one another in their finest attire, where relationships would be formed and social hierarchies would be subtly reinforced. The wide landings provided spaces for conversation and observation, while the elegant surroundings created an atmosphere that encouraged passengers to present themselves at their best. The staircase was a theater of social interaction, a place where the daily drama of first-class life would unfold in full view of fellow passengers. The Titanic was also remarkable for its use of electric elevators, a technology that was still relatively new in 1912, but which the ship's designers embraced as a means of providing unprecedented convenience and luxury for their passengers. The elevators were beautifully appointed, with polished wood paneling and brass fixtures that matched the elegant decor of the rest of the ship. The operators were uniformed attendants who provided courteous service while managing the complex mechanical systems that made this convenience possible. The electric elevators served not just as a practical convenience, but as a symbol of the ship's modernity and technological sophistication. Passengers could move between decks with ease, without the effort of climbing stairs or the inconvenience of navigating narrow corridors. The elevators were spacious enough to accommodate passengers in their finest attire, including the elaborate dresses and formal wear that were expected in first-class society. The smooth, quiet operation of these mechanical marvels contributed to the overall sense of luxury and refinement that characterized the first-class experience. The electrical systems that powered the elevators were part of a comprehensive network of modern technology that set the Titanic apart from earlier ships. The ship's generators provided power for lighting throughout the vessel, for the operation of various mechanical systems, and for the wireless communication equipment that kept the ship in contact with the outside world. The electric lighting was a particular source of pride, providing bright, clean illumination that made the ship's interior spaces feel more like those of a fine hotel than a traditional ship. Life in third-class steerage. As we descend from the rarefied heights of first-class luxury to the lower decks of the Titanic, we enter a different world entirely, one where the realities of ocean travel were more apparent, and the accommodations, while still remarkable for their time, reflected the practical considerations of transporting large numbers of passengers at affordable prices. The third-class accommodations, often referred to as steerage, housed the majority of the Titanic's passengers, men and women, who were seeking new lives in America, and who saw the ship not as a floating palace but as a means of reaching their dreams. The third-class cabins were small, practical spaces designed to accommodate passengers who were willing to sacrifice luxury for affordability. These cabins typically housed 4 passengers in bunk beds, with minimal furniture and storage space. The walls were painted white to create a sense of cleanliness and brightness, while the floors were covered with practical linoleum that could be easily cleaned and maintained. The furnishings were simple but adequate, including wash basins with running water and basic bedding that provided reasonable comfort for the duration of the crossing. Despite their modest size and simple appointments, the third-class cabins on the Titanic were actually quite advanced for their time, offering amenities that would have been considered luxurious on many other ships. The availability of running water in each cabin was a significant improvement over the common facilities that were typical of steerage accommodations on other vessels. The cabins were also heated and ventilated, providing a level of comfort that helped make the long Atlantic crossing more bearable for passengers who were often traveling with all their worldly possessions in hopes of starting new lives in America. The third-class dining room was a large, practical space that could accommodate hundreds of passengers at long tables that encouraged conversation and the formation of friendships among travelers who were sharing the same hopes and dreams. The meals served in third class were simple but nutritious, featuring hearty fare that was designed to provide the energy and sustenance needed for the long journey. The dining room was often filled with the sounds of multiple languages, as passengers from different countries and cultures shared their meals and their stories. The atmosphere in third class was one of hope and anticipation, despite the modest accommodations and the challenges of the journey. Many of the passengers were immigrants who had saved for years to afford their passage, families who were leaving behind everything they had known in search of better opportunities in the new world. The cramped quarters and simple furnishings seemed less important when viewed in the context of the dreams and aspirations that drove these passengers to undertake such a momentous journey. The third-class passengers had access to their own public spaces, including a smoking room where men could gather to share tobacco and conversation, and a general room where families could spend time together away from the confines of their small cabins. These spaces were furnished simply but adequately, with wooden benches and tables that could accommodate the various activities that helped pass the time during the long crossing. The rooms were kept clean and well maintained, reflecting the ship's commitment to providing decent accommodations for all passengers regardless of their ability to pay for luxury. The third-class passengers also had access to deck space where they could take the air and enjoy the sight of the ocean, though their promenade areas were more modest than those available to first and second-class passengers. The deck spaces allocated to third class were practical rather than elegant, with simple railings and minimal shelter from the elements. However, these areas provided essential opportunities for exercise and fresh air that were crucial for maintaining health and spirits during the long ocean crossing. The children traveling in third class were particularly visible in these public spaces, playing games and forming friendships that helped make the journey more bearable for their families. The presence of children added a sense of hope and future possibility to the third class areas, reminding everyone that this journey was not just about escaping the past, but about building a better future for the next generation. The architecture of social hierarchy. The physical layout of the Titanic was not merely a matter of engineering efficiency or practical convenience. It was a carefully constructed representation of the social hierarchies that defined Edwardian society. The ship's designers understood that their passengers came from different social classes with different expectations and different means, and they created a floating world that reflected and reinforced these distinctions through the very architecture of the vessel. The vertical organization of the ship was perhaps the most obvious manifestation of this social hierarchy, with the first-class accommodations occupying the upper decks, where the motion of the ship was least noticeable and the views were most impressive. The second-class accommodations were located on the middle decks, providing a comfortable middle ground between luxury and economy, while the third-class passengers were housed in the lower decks, where the engine noise was more apparent and the accommodations were more basic. This vertical stratification was not accidental, but was designed to create clear physical boundaries between the different classes of passengers. The first-class passengers could enjoy their promenade decks and public spaces without encountering passengers from lower classes, while the third-class passengers were confined to their own areas of the ship. The barriers between classes were not just social but physical, with locked doors and restricted access that ensured that the social order on land would be maintained at sea. The corridor systems and stairways of the ship were designed to reinforce these class distinctions, with separate routes for different classes of passengers that minimized the possibility of uncomfortable encounters between people of different social stations. The first-class passengers had access to the most direct and elegant routes between their accommodations and the public spaces, while third-class passengers were required to use more circuitous paths that kept them away from the luxury areas of the ship. The public spaces available to each class were also carefully designed to reflect their social position and expectations. The first-class passengers had access to multiple lounges, dining rooms, and recreational facilities, each one designed to provide a different type of social experience. The second-class passengers had their own smaller but still comfortable public spaces, while the third-class passengers shared larger, more basic facilities that served their practical needs without providing the luxury that was reserved for those who could afford to pay for it. The allocation of deck space also reflected these social hierarchies, with the first-class passengers enjoying the most desirable promenade areas at the highest levels of the ship, where they could walk in comfort while enjoying unobstructed views of the ocean. The second-class passengers had access to their own deck areas, while the third-class passengers were confined to smaller, less desirable spaces that were often more exposed to the elements and the noise of the ship's machinery. The dining arrangements on the ship were particularly revealing of these social distinctions, with separate restaurants for each class that served different types of food and provided different levels of service. The first-class dining room was an elegant restaurant that rivaled the finest establishments on land, while the second-class dining room provided good food and service in comfortable surroundings. The third-class dining room was a practical space that served simple but adequate meals in an atmosphere that emphasized functionality over luxury. Even the ship's crew was organized according to these social hierarchies, with officers and senior crew members enjoying accommodations and privileges that reflected their status within the ship's social structure. The captain and senior officers had elegant quarters that befitted their position, while the ordinary seamen and service staff were housed in modest accommodations that reflected their working-class status. The floating city's daily rhythms, life aboard the Titanic, followed rhythms that were dictated not just by the ship's schedule and the needs of the voyage, but by the social expectations and customs of the different classes of passengers. The ship was like a floating city, complete with its own daily routines, its own social customs, and its own unspoken rules about proper behavior and social interaction. The first-class passengers followed a schedule that was designed to maximize their comfort and enjoyment, while minimizing any awareness of the practical realities of being at sea. Their days would begin with breakfast, served in their cabins or in the elegant first-class dining room, followed by leisurely walks on the promenade decks, or time spent in the various public spaces, reading, conversing, or simply enjoying the luxury of their surroundings. The afternoons might be spent in the gymnasium, the swimming pool, or the Turkish baths, while the evenings were devoted to elaborate dinners and social gatherings that could extend well into the night. The second-class passengers enjoyed a somewhat more modest version of this routine, with comfortable accommodations and good food served in pleasant surroundings. Their days were less elaborate than those of the first-class passengers, but still provided plenty of opportunities for rest, recreation, and social interaction. The second-class passengers often formed close friendships during the voyage, bonding over shared experiences and common interests in ways that were sometimes more genuine than the more formal social interactions of the first-class passengers. The third-class passengers followed routines that were more practical and less leisurely, reflecting both their more modest means and their often more urgent reasons for making the journey. Many of these passengers were immigrants who were using the voyage as a time to prepare for their new lives in America, studying English, sharing information about their destinations, and supporting each other through the challenges of leaving their homelands behind. The third-class areas often buzzed with activity as passengers organized informal schools, shared meals, and participated in the simple entertainments that helped pass the time during the long crossing. The ship's crew worked around the clock to maintain the complex systems that kept the Titanic running smoothly, from the engine room crews who tended the massive machinery that powered the ship to the dining room staff, who served hundreds of meals each day. The crew members were largely invisible to the passengers, working behind the scenes to create the impression of effortless luxury and comfort that was the hallmark of the White Star Line's service. The evening hours aboard the Titanic were particularly magical, as the ship's lights created a warm glow against the darkness of the ocean. The first-class passengers would gather in the elegant public spaces for after-dinner conversation and entertainment, while the second and third-class passengers would create their own forms of amusement in their respective areas of the ship. The sound of music, conversation, and laughter would drift through the corridors, creating an atmosphere of warmth and humanity that made the vast ocean seem less lonely and forbidding. The floating palace revealed. As we conclude our gentle journey through the interior spaces of the Titanic, we are left with an appreciation for the remarkable achievement that this ship represented. The Titanic was not merely a means of transportation, but a complete floating world, carefully designed to provide its passengers with experiences that would match their expectations and social positions while carrying them safely across the Atlantic to their destinations. The ship's interior reflected the values and assumptions of the Edwardian world that created her, with its rigid social hierarchies and its confidence in the power of technology and human ingenuity to create something unprecedented in luxury and comfort. The Titanic was a floating microcosm of the society that built her, complete with its own class distinctions, its own social customs, and its own unspoken rules about proper behavior and social interaction. The attention to detail, evident in every aspect of the ship's interior design, revealed the pride and craftsmanship of those who created her, from the architects who designed her spaces to the skilled artisans who crafted her furnishings. The Titanic was a testament to the power of human creativity and skill, a floating palace that demonstrated what could be achieved when vision, resources, and expertise were combined in pursuit of excellence. The social hierarchies built into the ship's design reflected the world of 1912, but they also created opportunities for human connection and shared experience that transcended class boundaries. The voyage brought together people from different backgrounds and different circumstances, united by the common experience of crossing the Atlantic and the shared hopes for what they would find on the other side. As we drift away from our exploration of the Titanic's interior spaces, we carry with us images of elegant dining rooms and modest cabins, of grand staircases and simple public spaces, of the complex social world that existed within the hull of this remarkable ship. The Titanic was a floating palace that contained within her steel sides the dreams and aspirations of everyone who sailed upon her, from the wealthiest first-class passengers to the humblest third-class travelers seeking new lives in America. In the gentle rhythm of the ocean waves and the quiet satisfaction of a journey well begun, the Titanic carried her passengers through the days and nights of the Atlantic crossing, providing them with a floating world of comfort, luxury, and human connection that would remain in their memories long after they had reached their destinations. The ship was a testament to human ambition and achievement, a floating palace that demonstrated the power of vision and craftsmanship to create something truly extraordinary. Chapter 3: The Passengers. As the great ship Titanic made her way through the calm waters of the North Atlantic, she carried within her steel hull a remarkable collection of human souls. Each passenger and crew member aboard represented a different story, a different dream, a different hope for the future. From the grandest first-class suites to the most humble third-class cabins, the ship was a floating microcosm of society itself, bringing together people from vastly different walks of life, all united by their shared journey across the ocean. In the luxurious first-class accommodations, where crystal chandeliers cast gentle light across polished mahogany panels, traveled some of the wealthiest and most influential people of their time. These were the titans of industry, the inheritors of great fortunes, the social elite who moved through the world with the confidence that comes from unlimited resources and unquestioned privilege. Their presence on the Titanic was not merely a matter of transportation, but a statement of prestige, a demonstration of their place in the carefully ordered hierarchy of Edwardian society. Among these distinguished passengers was John Jacob Astor IV, a man whose very name carried the weight of American industrial might. At 47 years old, Astor was one of the wealthiest men in the world, his fortune built upon the foundation laid by his great-grandfather's fur trading empire and expanded through shrewd investments in real estate and technology. He had recently married Madeline Talmadge Force, a young woman of 18 whose beauty and charm had captured his heart despite the considerable difference in their ages. Their honeymoon journey had taken them across Europe and Egypt, and now they were returning home to New York, where Astor's business empire awaited his attention. The couple occupied one of the most luxurious suites on the ship, a testament to Astor's wealth and status. Madeline, now 5 months pregnant with their first child, found comfort in the spacious accommodations as she prepared for the journey ahead. The suite was appointed with the finest furnishings, soft carpets that muffled footsteps, and large windows that provided sweeping views of the endless ocean. Here, surrounded by luxury, they could almost forget that they were traveling at all, so smooth was the ship's passage through the relatively calm seas. Astor himself was a man of many interests and talents. He had authored science fiction novels, developed patents for various inventions, and even produced a bicycle brake that had earned him additional income beyond his already substantial wealth. His mind was constantly at work, analyzing problems and seeking solutions with the same methodical approach that had made him successful in business. As he walked the decks of the Titanic, he no doubt contemplated the engineering marvel that carried him, appreciating the technical innovations that made such a vessel possible. Not far from the Astor Suite, in equally opulent accommodations, traveled Benjamin Guggenheim, another pillar of American industry. The Guggenheim family had built their fortune in mining and smelting, creating an empire that stretched across continents and employed thousands of workers. Benjamin, at 46, represented the third generation of his family's business dynasty, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had never known want or uncertainty. Guggenheim was traveling with his valet, Victor Gilliot, and his secretary Nicolas Sauger, along with Leontine Aubart, a young French woman who had become his companion. The complexities of his personal life reflected the broader contradictions of his era, when public propriety often masked private arrangements that defied conventional morality. Despite these complications, or perhaps because of them, Guggenheim seemed to approach life with a certain philosophical detachment, as if he understood that all human endeavors, no matter how grand or successful, were ultimately temporary. The mining magnate spent much of his time on board reading and conversing with other passengers, his conversations ranging from business matters to questions of art and culture. He was known to be a patron of the arts, and his appreciation for beauty extended beyond mere material possessions to encompass literature, music, and philosophy. In the quiet moments between meals and social obligations, he could often be found in the ship's library, lost in thought as he contemplated the pages of a book or gazed out at the vast expanse of water that surrounded them. Among the most colorful and memorable of the first-class passengers was Margaret Brown, though she would later become known to history by the nickname Molly, a name she herself rarely used. Brown represented a different type of American success story, one built not on inherited wealth, but on determination, intelligence, and no small amount of luck. She had been born into poverty in Missouri, but through marriage to James Joseph Brown, a mining engineer who struck it rich in Colorado's gold fields, she had risen to become one of Denver's most prominent citizens. At 44, Margaret Brown possessed an energy and vitality that seemed almost inexhaustible. She was deeply involved in social causes, particularly women's suffrage and workers' rights, and she had spent considerable time in Europe studying languages and culture. Her journey on the Titanic was part of a larger adventure that had taken her from her home in Denver to Paris, where she had been studying French and immersing herself in the artistic and intellectual life of the city. Brown's cabin was filled with the souvenirs of her travels, carefully packed trunks containing clothes, books, and artwork that she had collected during her time abroad. She was not content to simply observe the world around her, but insisted on engaging with it fully, learning new languages, meeting new people, and challenging herself to grow beyond the limitations that others might have accepted. Her presence on the ship was felt throughout the first-class sections, as she moved easily between different social groups, equally comfortable conversing with wealthy industrialists and middle-class families. The contrast between Brown's background and that of passengers like Astor and Guggenheim illustrated the complex nature of American society at the turn of the 20th century. While the older families of the East Coast maintained their positions through inherited wealth and established social connections, the newer fortunes of the West were built on opportunity, risk-taking, and the kind of social mobility that was becoming increasingly rare in the more stratified societies of Europe. As the ship continued its journey through the night, the first-class passengers settled into their routines of meals, conversation, and quiet contemplation. The dining room, with its elegant appointments and attentive service, provided a stage for the subtle social dramas that played out among the wealthy elite. Conversations flowed easily from business matters to social gossip, from discussions of art and literature to speculations about the future of technology and industry. Yet beneath the surface of these comfortable routines lay currents of change and uncertainty that even the wealthiest passengers could not ignore. The world was in transition, moving away from the certainties of the Victorian era towards something new and unknown. Labor movements were gaining strength, women were demanding political rights, and the rigid social hierarchies that had defined the 19th century were beginning to show signs of strain. Far below the first-class decks, in the more modest accommodations of second and third class, traveled a very different group of passengers. These were not the titans of industry or the inheritors of great fortunes, but rather ordinary people seeking to build better lives for themselves and their families. Many were immigrants, leaving behind the familiar landscapes of Europe for the promise of opportunity in America. Others were Americans returning home after business or pleasure trips abroad, carrying with them memories of distant places and different ways of life. The second-class passengers occupied a middle ground between the luxury of first class and the basic accommodations of third class. Their cabins were comfortable if not lavish, furnished with the kinds of amenities that would have been considered quite acceptable in most middle-class homes of the time. These passengers included merchants, teachers, clergymen, and skilled craftsmen, people who had achieved a measure of success but had not yet reached the heights of wealth and social position enjoyed by those in first class. Among the second-class passengers were families traveling together, their conversations filled with plans for the future and memories of the past. Children played quietly in the corridors, their voices a gentle counterpoint to the deeper rumble of the ship's engines. Parents watched over them with the careful attention of those who understood that this journey represented not just a change of location, but a complete transformation of their lives and circumstances. The third-class passengers, often referred to as steerage, represented the largest group aboard the Titanic. These were the emigrants, the dreamers, the desperate, and the determined, all united by their belief that America offered something better than what they were leaving behind. They came from Ireland and Sweden, from Italy and Lebanon, from the far corners of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, each bringing their own languages, customs, and hopes for the future. Their accommodations were simple but clean, a marked improvement over the conditions that had prevailed on immigrant ships of previous decades. The White Star Line had made efforts to provide decent living conditions for all passengers, regardless of their ability to pay premium prices. The third-class dining room served wholesome, if basic, meals, and the common areas provided space for socializing and relaxation during the long journey across the Atlantic. These passengers carried with them not just their personal belongings, but the accumulated wisdom and traditions of their homelands. In their conversations, conducted in a dozen different languages, they shared stories of the places they had left behind, the reasons for their departure, and their dreams for what awaited them in America. Some traveled alone, young men and women seeking adventure and opportunity. Others came as families, with children who would grow up as Americans, speaking English as their native language, and knowing their parents' homeland only through stories and memories. The Irish passengers, many of them from the rural counties of the West, brought with them the musical traditions of their homeland. In the evenings, as the ship settled into its rhythmic passage through the ocean, the sound of traditional songs could be heard drifting through the corridors of third class. These melodies, passed down through generations, provided comfort and connection to those who had left everything familiar behind in pursuit of a better life. Swedish families, many of them bound for the farmlands of the American Midwest, spoke quietly among themselves about the letters they had received from relatives, who had made the journey before them. These letters, carefully preserved and frequently reread, painted pictures of vast open spaces, fertile soil, and opportunities for those willing to work hard and persevere through the challenges of building new lives in a strange land. Italian passengers, primarily from the impoverished regions of the south, carried with them the skills and traditions of their ancestors. Stonemasons, craftsmen, and laborers, they understood that their success in America would depend on their willingness to work with their hands and their ability to adapt their old world skills to new world opportunities. Their conversations often centered on the cities where they hoped to settle, places like New York and Boston, where earlier waves of Italian immigrants had established communities that could provide support and familiarity in an otherwise foreign environment. The ship's crew, numbering nearly 900 souls, represented yet another layer of the complex social structure aboard the Titanic. At the top of this hierarchy stood Captain Edward Smith, a man whose reputation for seamanship and safety had earned him the nickname the Millionaire's Captain. At 62, Smith was nearing the end of a distinguished career that had spanned over 4 decades at sea. This voyage was to be his last before retirement, a fitting conclusion to a life spent in service to the great passenger lines that connected the continents. Captain Smith carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had earned his position through competence and dedication rather than political maneuvering or family connections. His presence on the bridge was reassuring to passengers and crew alike, for he embodied the long tradition of British seamanship that had made the Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine the envy of the world. His white beard and weathered features spoke of countless voyages through calm seas and violent storms, of responsibilities shouldered and duties faithfully discharged. The captain's quarters, located near the bridge, were spartanly furnished but comfortable, reflecting the practical nature of a man who had spent most of his adult life at sea. Here, in the quiet hours of the night watch, he would review the ship's progress, study weather reports, and contemplate the responsibilities that rested on his shoulders. The safety of over 2,000 souls depended on his decisions, his experience, and his ability to respond effectively to whatever challenges the ocean might present. Below the captain in the ship's hierarchy were the officers, men who had dedicated their lives to the sea and who understood the complex systems that kept the great vessel moving safely through the water. Chief Officer Henry Wilde, First Officer William Murdoch, and the other members of the deck crew represented the professional expertise that made transatlantic travel possible. These men had trained for years to understand every aspect of the ship's operation, from navigation and communication to emergency procedures and passenger safety. The engine room crew, working far below the waterline in conditions of tremendous heat and noise, represented the industrial muscle that drove the Titanic through the water. These men, many of them from the working-class districts of Belfast and Liverpool, understood the massive machinery that converted coal into steam and steam into the power that turned the ship's propellers. Their work was dangerous and demanding, requiring constant attention to boilers, engines, and the 1,000 mechanical details that kept the ship moving forward. The stokers, who fed coal into the ship's furnaces around the clock, worked in conditions that would have been considered hellish by those who enjoyed the comfort of the passenger decks above. The temperature in the stokehold often exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was thick with coal dust and steam. Yet these men took pride in their work, understanding that their efforts were essential to the ship's operation and the comfort of all aboard. The Titanic's crew also included hundreds of men and women who ensured the comfort and safety of the passengers. Stewards and stewardesses attended to the needs of those in first, second, and third class, providing meals, maintaining cabins, and offering assistance with the countless small needs that arise during a long ocean voyage. These crew members, many of them from the service industries of England and Ireland, brought to their work a tradition of hospitality and attention to detail that had made British passenger service renowned throughout the world. The ship's musicians, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley, provided entertainment and atmosphere for the passengers, particularly those in first and second class. These 8 professional musicians had been hired not just for their technical skill, but for their ability to create the kind of refined ambiance that wealthy passengers expected during their travels. In the first-class lounge and dining room, their performances provided a sophisticated backdrop for conversations and social interactions that helped pass the time during the long journey across the Atlantic. As the Titanic continued her passage through the dark waters of the North Atlantic, all of these different groups of people settled into the rhythms of shipboard life. The wealthy first-class passengers enjoyed their luxurious accommodations and elaborate meals, attending concerts and social gatherings that helped maintain the illusion that they were still in the comfortable world of hotels and private clubs. The second-class passengers found their own entertainment and companionship, creating a more modest but equally genuine sense of community among those who shared similar backgrounds and circumstances. The third-class passengers, despite their more limited accommodations, discovered their own forms of joy and connection during the voyage. Music and dancing, storytelling and quiet conversation, the sharing of food, and the exchange of dreams and plans for the future all served to create bonds among people who might otherwise have remained strangers. Children played games that transcended language barriers, while adults found ways to communicate despite speaking different tongues. Throughout the ship, the crew maintained the complex systems and services that made the voyage possible. In the engine rooms, the bridge, the kitchens and the passenger areas, hundreds of men and women worked with quiet efficiency to ensure that the great vessel continued its journey safely and comfortably. Their efforts were largely invisible to the passengers, but they represented the accumulated expertise and dedication of generations of maritime professionals. The diversity of the Titanic's passengers and crew reflected the broader currents of change that were reshaping the world at the beginning of the 20th century. The old certainties of the Victorian era were giving way to new forms of social organization, new technologies, and new ideas about what was possible for ordinary people. The immigrants in third class carried with them not just their personal hopes, but the dreams of entire communities who saw in America the possibility of lives that would have been unimaginable in the rigid social structures of their homelands. The wealthy passengers in first class, for their part, represented both the achievements and the limitations of the industrial age. Their fortunes had been built on the transformation of traditional economies, the exploitation of natural resources, and the organization of human labor on an unprecedented scale. Yet they also embodied the cultural and intellectual flowering that such prosperity could make possible, patronizing arts and sciences, supporting educational institutions, and creating the kind of leisured society that could devote time and resources to the pursuit of knowledge and beauty. As the night deepened and the ship continued its steady progress through the calm seas, the passengers and crew of the Titanic settled into sleep, each carrying their own dreams and concerns into the realm of rest. The first-class passengers retired to their luxurious staterooms, where soft beds and fine linens provided the kind of comfort they had always known. The second-class passengers found their own rest in accommodations that, while more modest, were still comfortable and clean. The third-class passengers crowded into smaller spaces but surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of their fellow travelers, discovered their own forms of peace and rest. The crew, working in shifts around the clock, maintained their vigilant watch over the great ship and all souls aboard. In the engine rooms, the bridge, and throughout the vessel, men remained at their posts, ensuring that the Titanic continued her journey through the darkness toward the distant shores of America. Their dedication and professionalism represented the best traditions of maritime service, the accumulated wisdom of generations of sailors who had learned to read the moods of the sea and to respond to its challenges with skill and courage. In the quiet hours of the night, as the ship moved steadily westward through the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the diverse company aboard the Titanic shared a common experience of anticipation and hope. Whether they were wealthy industrialists returning from European travels, middle-class families seeking new opportunities, or immigrants pursuing dreams of a better life, all were united by their faith in the future and their belief that the journey they had undertaken would lead to something better than what they had left behind. The great ship that carried them through the darkness was more than just a means of transportation. It was a symbol of human achievement and ambition, a testament to the power of technology and organization to overcome the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Yet it also carried within its steel hull all the complexities and contradictions of the society that had created it. The vast inequalities of wealth and opportunity, the dreams and fears of ordinary people, and the quiet heroism of those who dedicated their lives to serving others. As the Titanic continued her journey through the night, carrying her precious cargo of human hopes and dreams toward an uncertain future, she embodied both the promise and the fragility of the age that had created her. In just a few hours, that fragility would be tested in ways that none aboard could have imagined, and the diverse company of passengers and crew would face together a challenge that would reveal both the best and the worst of human nature under the most extreme circumstances possible. Chapter 5. The Collision. The night of April 14, 1912 settled over the North Atlantic with an unusual stillness that would later be remembered as both beautiful and ominous. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface so calm it resembled a vast mirror reflecting the brilliant canopy of stars above. There was no moon to illuminate the water, leaving the night darker than most who sailed these waters had ever experienced. The temperature had been dropping steadily throughout the evening, and by 11 o'clock, the air had turned bitterly cold, creating conditions that would prove both treacherous and tragically significant. On the bridge of the Titanic, the watch officers maintained their vigilant surveillance of the waters ahead. The ship continued her steady westward course at a speed of approximately 22 knots, her engines maintaining the rhythmic pulse that had carried her across the Atlantic for the past 4 days. Captain Smith had retired to his cabin for the evening, but not before reviewing the ice warnings that had been received throughout the day. These messages, transmitted by wireless from other ships in the area, reported the presence of icebergs along the shipping lanes, a common occurrence during the spring months when the winter ice from the Arctic began its slow drift southward. The lookouts in the Crow's Nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, stood at their posts high above the ship's forecastle, their eyes trained on the horizon ahead. The bitter cold made their duty particularly challenging, and the absence of binoculars, which had been misplaced during the ship's departure from Southampton, further complicated their ability to spot potential hazards in the darkness. The stillness of the night, while creating an atmosphere of peaceful beauty, also eliminated one of the most reliable methods of detecting icebergs at a distance. Without waves breaking against the base of an iceberg, there would be no telltale white foam to mark its presence against the dark water. As the night progressed, the temperature continued to drop, and ice began to form on the ship's rigging and exposed surfaces. The crew members on duty pulled their coats tighter against the cold, while passengers who had ventured onto the decks for evening strolls quickly retreated to the warmth of the ship's interior. The first-class passengers, many of whom had enjoyed a leisurely dinner in the elegant dining room, settled into their luxurious staterooms for the night. The sound of conversation and laughter gradually faded as the ship's company prepared for sleep, trusting in the vessel's reputation for safety and the skill of her crew. In the wireless room, operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride continued their work, sending and receiving messages for passengers and maintaining communication with other ships and shore stations. The constant chatter of Morse code filled the small compartment as they processed the backlog of personal messages that had accumulated during the voyage. Among these routine communications were additional ice warnings from ships in the area, messages that detailed the location and movement of icebergs along the shipping routes. Some of these warnings reached the bridge, while others remained in the wireless room, their significance not immediately recognized in the context of the evening's routine operations. The ship's officers on the bridge maintained their watch with the professional attention that had become second nature through years of experience at sea. First Officer William Murdoch had assumed command of the bridge watch at 10 o'clock, bringing to his duty the careful attention to detail that had earned him the respect of his colleagues and superiors. The night was progressing, as countless others had during his career, with the steady rhythm of the engines below and the gentle movement of the ship through the calm waters providing a familiar backdrop to the routine of navigation and observation. As the ship continued her passage through the darkness, the passengers and crew aboard were largely unaware of the invisible drama that was unfolding around them. The ice field that lay ahead had been forming for months, as massive bergs broke away from the glaciers of Greenland and began their slow journey southward along the coast of Labrador. These ancient formations, some of them containing ice that had been compressed over thousands of years, drifted silently through the shipping lanes, their presence known only to those ships fortunate enough to spot them in time, or wise enough to reduce speed in response to the warnings that had been transmitted throughout the day. The particular iceberg that would soon intersect with the Titanic's path was a massive formation, though not unusually large by the standards of those who regularly sailed these waters. Its visible portion rose perhaps 60 feet above the waterline, while the much larger mass extended deep beneath the surface, following the natural law that governs such formations. The iceberg had been drifting for weeks, perhaps months, gradually moving southward along the current patterns that had carried countless similar formations through these waters over the centuries. At 23 minutes past 11 o'clock, lookout Frederick Fleet suddenly perceived a dark shape emerging from the gloom ahead. The object appeared gradually, as if materializing from the darkness itself, its outline becoming clearer as the ship continued her forward progress. For a moment, Fleet stared at the shape, his mind processing what his eyes were seeing and comparing it to the countless hours of training and experience that had prepared him for this moment. The realization came with startling clarity. A massive iceberg lay directly in the ship's path, so close that collision seemed inevitable. Fleet's response was immediate and decisive. He reached for the crow's nest telephone, connecting him directly to the bridge below, while simultaneously striking the warning bell 3 times, the traditional signal for an object ahead. The telephone rang on the bridge, where 6th Officer James Moody answered with the routine inquiry that had been repeated countless times during his watch duties. Fleet's voice, tense with urgency but controlled by his professional training, delivered the message that would change everything. Iceberg right ahead. The communication traveled instantly from Moody to First Officer Murdoch, who was standing nearby on the bridge. Murdoch's response demonstrated the quick thinking and decisive action that had made him a respected officer in the White Star Line. Without hesitation, he ordered the helm hard to starboard, attempting to turn the ship away from the iceberg's path. Simultaneously, he called for the engines to be put full astern, hoping to reduce the ship's forward momentum and minimize the impact of what was rapidly becoming an unavoidable collision. The few seconds that followed seemed to stretch into eternity for those who witnessed them. The massive ship, with her tremendous momentum and the physical laws that governed her movement through the water, began to respond to the helm commands. But slowly, far too slowly for the distance that remained between her bow and the towering wall of ice that lay ahead. The engines, already working at full capacity, struggled to reverse their direction, but the Titanic's enormous mass and forward velocity could not be overcome in the brief time available. In the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee watched helplessly as the iceberg grew larger and more distinct with each passing moment. The dark mass of ice, blue-white in the starlight, presented a sight that would remain etched in their memories for the rest of their lives. The ship's bow began to swing to port as the helm took effect, but the movement was agonizingly gradual, measured in degrees rather than the dramatic change of direction that might have saved them from impact. The collision itself was unlike what many aboard the ship had expected. Rather than the violent crash that might have been anticipated from the meeting of such massive objects, the initial contact was almost gentle, producing a sound that many passengers would later describe as resembling the ship passing over a submerged sandbar. The grinding noise that followed was more pronounced, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the very heart of the ship as her steel hull scraped along the underwater portion of the iceberg. On the bridge, the officers felt the ship shudder slightly as she made contact with the ice, but the sensation was surprisingly mild considering the magnitude of what was occurring. First Officer Murdoch immediately ordered the watertight doors to be closed, activating the system that would seal off the various compartments below the waterline. This precautionary measure, designed to prevent flooding from spreading throughout the ship, was executed with the efficiency that had been drilled into the crew through countless safety procedures and training exercises. The iceberg passed along the starboard side of the ship, its underwater projections scraping against the hull plates with a sound that penetrated to the deepest levels of the vessel. Passengers in their cabins heard the grinding noise and felt the slight vibration, but many assumed it was simply the ship passing through rougher water or perhaps adjusting her course for navigational purposes. The sound was not dramatic enough to cause immediate alarm, and most passengers continued with their evening routines, unaware that their lives had just changed forever. Below deck, however, the situation was far more serious than the relatively mild sensations felt by those above would suggest. The collision had opened a series of punctures in the ship's hull, creating openings through which the cold Atlantic water began to pour into the forward compartments. The damage extended across multiple watertight compartments, a scenario that the ship's designers had considered unlikely but not impossible. The flooding began immediately, with thousands of gallons of seawater rushing into the ship's interior spaces every minute. In the postal sorting room, located deep within the ship's forward section, the first signs of the disaster became apparent within minutes of the collision. The postal clerks, who had been working through the night to process the mail that would be delivered upon the ship's arrival in New York, suddenly found themselves standing in several inches of water. The flooding was not dramatic at first, merely a steady accumulation of seawater that seemed to appear from nowhere, rising gradually but persistently around their feet. The ship's carpenter, who was among the first to investigate the extent of the damage, reported back to the bridge with increasingly alarming news. The forward compartments were taking on water at a rate that exceeded the capacity of the pumping systems to remove it. The damage was not confined to a single area, but extended across multiple sections of the hull, creating a situation that would test the ship's design and construction to its limits. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who had been traveling aboard the Titanic to observe her performance during the maiden voyage, was summoned to assess the situation. His examination of the damage revealed the full extent of the crisis that was developing. The collision had breached the hull across 5 separate watertight compartments, one more than the ship had been designed to survive. The mathematical reality of the situation was inescapable. The Titanic was sinking. The realization of the ship's fate came gradually to those in positions of authority, each piece of evidence adding to the growing certainty that this was not a minor incident that could be repaired or contained. The rate of flooding, the extent of the damage, and the ship's increasing list to starboard all pointed to the same inevitable conclusion. Captain Smith, who had been awakened and summoned to the bridge immediately after the collision, found himself facing the most serious crisis of his long career at sea. The initial response of many passengers was confusion rather than panic. The ship's reputation for safety, combined with the relatively mild nature of the collision itself, led many to assume that any damage would be easily manageable. Passengers who had been awakened by the sound of the grinding along the hull peered out of their portholes or ventured onto the deck to investigate, but most saw nothing that would indicate a serious problem. The ship continued to move forward under her own power, and the lights remained on throughout the vessel. In the first-class areas, where passengers had been enjoying the late evening in the comfort of the smoking room or the elegant lounge, the collision caused only a momentary interruption in conversations and activities. Some passengers felt the ship shudder slightly, while others noticed that their drinks had moved slightly on the tables. But these sensations were easily dismissed as the normal movements of a large vessel at sea. The grinding sound was more noticeable, causing some to look up from their cards or books. But when it ceased and the ship continued on her way, most returned to their previous activities. The crew members who were on duty in various parts of the ship began to notice more significant changes in the hours following the collision. The ship's list to starboard became gradually more pronounced, though still subtle enough that many passengers would not immediately notice it. The sound of the engines, which had provided a constant background rhythm throughout the voyage, began to change as the engineering staff worked to assess and respond to the flooding in the forward compartments. In the third-class areas, where passengers were generally less insulated from the ship's mechanical systems, the signs of trouble became apparent somewhat earlier. The sound of rushing water could be heard in some areas, and the gradual change in the ship's attitude became noticeable to those who were familiar with the normal movements of a vessel at sea. However, even among these passengers, the initial response was more curiosity than alarm, as the full implications of what was happening had not yet become clear. The wireless operators, Phillips and Bride, continued their work in the communications room, unaware at first that anything unusual had occurred. The collision had not affected the ship's electrical systems, and the wireless equipment continued to function normally. It would be some time before they received instructions to begin transmitting the distress calls that would alert the world to the Titanic's plight. As the first hour after the collision passed, the reality of the situation began to dawn on those who had access to information about the ship's condition. The flooding continued at a rate that made it clear that the damage was far more serious than initially hoped. The ship's officers, trained to respond to emergencies with calm professionalism, began to implement the procedures that had been established for such situations, even as they grappled with the unprecedented nature of what they were facing. The Titanic's reputation as unsinkable, which had been built upon the advanced safety features incorporated into her design, now became a source of false confidence that would delay the recognition of the true severity of the situation. The ship's watertight compartments, her double bottom, and her sophisticated pumping systems had all been designed to handle the most serious emergencies that naval architects could imagine, but the specific nature of the damage caused by the collision had created a scenario that exceeded even these elaborate precautions. The passengers, many of whom had chosen to travel on the Titanic specifically because of her reputation for safety, found it difficult to believe that their situation was truly dangerous. The ship's size, her modern construction, and the confidence of her crew all contributed to a sense of security that would persist even as the evidence of the disaster mounted around them. The psychological impact of the ship's unsinkable reputation would prove to be as significant as any physical factor in determining how passengers and crew responded to the crisis. In the boiler rooms, where the ship's power was generated, the crew members found themselves facing the most immediate and dangerous consequences of the collision. The flooding seawater, meeting the intense heat of the boiler fires, created clouds of steam that made working conditions extremely hazardous. The men who tended these fires, many of whom had spent their entire careers in such environments, worked with desperate efficiency to maintain power for as long as possible, understanding that the ship's electrical systems and pumping equipment depended on their efforts. The gradual realization that the Titanic was indeed sinking came not all at once, but through a series of small recognitions and accumulating evidence that could no longer be ignored or explained away. The ship's officers, trained to maintain calm in the face of crisis, began the careful process of alerting passengers and crew to the reality of their situation, while avoiding the panic that could make an already difficult situation far worse. As the second hour after the collision began, the true nature of the disaster that had befallen the Titanic could no longer be denied by those who had access to information about the ship's condition. The flooding continued unabated, the ship's list became more pronounced, and the pumping systems, despite their sophisticated design, proved inadequate to the task of removing the vast quantities of water that were pouring into the hull. The realization that the ship was doomed marked the beginning of a new phase in the disaster, one that would test the courage, training, and humanity of everyone aboard the great vessel. Chapter 6, Chaos and Class. As the reality of the Titanic's fate began to dawn on those who understood the severity of the situation, the ship's crew faced the monumental task of organizing an evacuation that would test every aspect of their training and professionalism. The order to prepare the lifeboats came from Captain Smith himself, transmitted through the ship's officers with the calm efficiency that had characterized the White Star Line's operations throughout its history. Yet beneath this veneer of professional competence lay the stark mathematical reality that would soon become apparent to all: there were simply not enough lifeboats to accommodate everyone aboard the great vessel. The lifeboats on the Titanic, while meeting the legal requirements established by the Board of Trade, had been designed for a different era of maritime travel. The regulations that governed their number and capacity were based on the assumption that ships would remain afloat long enough for multiple trips to transfer passengers to rescue vessels, or that the boats would serve primarily as ferries between a sinking ship and nearby vessels that had come to assist. The concept of a ship the size of the Titanic sinking so quickly that all passengers and crew would need to abandon ship simultaneously had not been adequately considered in the safety regulations of the time. As the crew began the process of uncovering and preparing the lifeboats, the passengers gradually became aware that something more serious than a minor mechanical problem was occurring. The ship's list to starboard had become more pronounced, and the sound of rushing water could be heard in various parts of the vessel. The engines, which had provided a constant rhythmic background throughout the voyage, had fallen silent, leaving an eerie quiet that was broken only by the sounds of crew members working and the distant murmur of passenger conversations. The implementation of the evacuation procedures revealed the profound social divisions that had characterized life aboard the Titanic from the moment of departure. The ship's design, with its carefully segregated areas for different classes of passengers, now became a factor that would determine who would have access to the lifeboats and who would be left behind. The first-class passengers, whose accommodations were located closest to the boat deck, found themselves in the most advantageous position when the order came to abandon ship. Their proximity to the lifeboats, combined with their social status and the deference shown to them by the crew, meant that they would be among the first to be offered places in the boats. The crew members who supervised the loading of the lifeboats had been trained in the maritime tradition of women and children first, a principle that had evolved over centuries of seafaring as a practical and moral response to disasters at sea. This protocol, known formally as the Birkenhead drill, after a famous shipwreck of the previous century, was intended to ensure that the most vulnerable passengers would be given priority in the limited spaces available in the lifeboats. However, the implementation of this principle aboard the Titanic would prove to be far from uniform, influenced by the social hierarchies and physical barriers that had been built into the ship's very structure. On the port side of the ship, Second Officer Charles Lightoller interpreted the women and children first order with absolute rigidity, refusing to allow any men into the lifeboats until all women and children had been accommodated. His adherence to this principle was so strict that he would later be criticized for launching lifeboats that were only partially filled rather than allowing men to take up the empty spaces. Lightoller's decisions were influenced by his understanding of maritime law and tradition, as well as his belief that maintaining order and discipline was essential to preventing panic and ensuring that as many lives as possible could be saved. On the starboard side, First Officer William Murdoch took a somewhat different approach, allowing men to enter the lifeboats when no women or children were immediately available to fill the spaces. This more flexible interpretation of the evacuation protocol resulted in a higher number of male survivors from the starboard side boats, though the overall survival rate remained tragically low. The difference in approach between the two officers illustrated the challenges of implementing emergency procedures under unprecedented circumstances, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of people. The passengers in first class, awakened by stewards who knocked gently on their cabin doors and advised them to put on their life jackets and proceed to the boat deck, initially treated the evacuation as something of an inconvenience rather than a matter of life and death. Many dressed carefully in their finest clothes, as if preparing for a formal occasion, while others gathered valuable possessions and papers that they were reluctant to leave behind. The atmosphere in the first-class areas remained relatively calm, with passengers conversing quietly among themselves and offering mutual support and encouragement. Margaret Brown, who would later become known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, moved through the first-class areas, helping other passengers and encouraging them to take the evacuation seriously. Her natural leadership abilities and her practical understanding of the situation made her an invaluable asset during the crisis. Brown's actions during the evacuation demonstrated the kind of courage and selflessness that would emerge among passengers of all classes as the disaster unfolded, though her first-class status ensured that she had access to the boat deck and the opportunity to exercise these qualities. John Jacob Astor, despite his immense wealth and social position, found himself subject to the same women and children first protocol as other male passengers. After helping his pregnant wife Madeline into lifeboat number 4, he was forced to step back and accept that he would not be allowed to accompany her. The scene of their parting, conducted with the quiet dignity that was expected of people of their social standing, illustrated both the democratic nature of the disaster and the way in which social conventions continued to operate even in the face of mortal danger. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining magnate who had spent much of the voyage in quiet contemplation, faced the approaching end with a philosophical acceptance that impressed those who witnessed his final hours. After helping other passengers toward the lifeboats, he reportedly returned to his cabin to change into evening dress, explaining that he wished to meet death as a gentleman. His actions, whether motivated by fatalism, courage, or a desire to maintain dignity in the face of the inevitable, became part of the legend that would grow around the Titanic disaster. The second-class passengers, whose accommodations were located further from the boat deck, faced greater challenges in reaching the lifeboats. The ship's layout, with its maze of corridors and stairways, made navigation difficult in the best of circumstances, and the increasing list and the darkness created additional obstacles. Many second-class passengers found themselves confused about which direction to go, and some became separated from their families in the confusion of the evacuation. The crew members assigned to assist with the evacuation worked tirelessly to guide passengers toward the boat deck, but their efforts were hampered by the ship's design and the sheer number of people who needed to be moved. The narrow corridors and steep stairways that had seemed elegant during the voyage now became bottlenecks that slowed the movement of passengers and created opportunities for confusion and panic. Some crew members remained at their posts in the lower levels of the ship, continuing to provide assistance and maintain order even as the water rose around them. The situation in third class, where the majority of the ship's passengers were housed, was far more desperate than what was occurring in the upper levels of the vessel. The third-class accommodations, located in the lowest passenger areas of the ship, were the first to feel the effects of the flooding. The passengers in these areas, many of whom spoke little or no English, found themselves trapped behind locked gates that had been installed to prevent the mixing of different classes of passengers during the voyage. These barriers, which had been designed to maintain the social segregation that was considered essential to the ship's operation, now became deadly obstacles that prevented third-class passengers from reaching the boat deck. The gates were locked not out of malice, but as part of the normal security procedures that governed the ship's operation. However, in the crisis of the evacuation, these barriers became symbols of the class divisions that had characterized the voyage from its beginning. Some crew members worked heroically to unlock the gates and guide third-class passengers toward the boat deck, but their efforts were often too little and too late. The ship's design, with its complex layout and multiple levels, made it difficult for passengers unfamiliar with the vessel's geography to find their way to safety. Many third-class passengers, particularly those who did not speak English, found themselves dependent on the assistance of crew members who were themselves overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster. The families traveling in third class faced particularly heartbreaking choices as they attempted to reach the lifeboats. Parents struggled to keep their children together while navigating the confusing passages and stairways, and many found themselves separated in the chaos of the evacuation. The women and children first protocol, when it could be implemented in the third-class areas, often meant that families were broken apart, with mothers and children being directed toward lifeboats, while fathers and older sons were left behind. The language barriers that existed among the third-class passengers created additional complications during the evacuation. Instructions given in English were not understood by many of the immigrants who made up the majority of the third-class complement. Italian, Swedish, Irish, and Lebanese passengers found themselves relying on gestures and the universal language of panic to understand what was expected of them. Some passengers who spoke multiple languages attempted to serve as interpreters, but the chaos of the situation made effective communication extremely difficult. The lifeboats themselves, as they were lowered into the calm waters of the North Atlantic, presented a study in the social dynamics that had characterized the voyage. The boats designated for first-class passengers were generally well organized and properly equipped, with crew members or experienced passengers taking charge of the rowing and navigation. The occupants of these boats, while certainly frightened and concerned about their fate, maintained the social conventions and courtesies that had defined their interactions throughout the voyage. Many of the lifeboats were launched with far fewer occupants than their rated capacity, a decision that would later be the subject of intense criticism and investigation. The reasons for this seemingly wasteful use of limited resources were complex and varied. Some officers worried that the boats, which had been designed for use in calm seas, might not be strong enough to hold their full complement of passengers. Others were concerned that lowering fully loaded boats from the great height of the Titanic's deck might result in the boats being damaged or capsized. The process of loading the lifeboats also revealed the extent to which panic and confusion had begun to spread among the passengers. Some people, particularly those who had never been to sea before, were terrified of the prospect of being lowered into the dark ocean in what seemed like a small and fragile boat. Others refused to believe that the great ship was actually sinking and declined to leave what they perceived as the safety of the vessel for the uncertainty of the lifeboats. The crew members who supervised the loading of the boats faced an impossible situation, trying to balance the need to fill the boats to capacity with the necessity of maintaining order and preventing panic. Their training had not prepared them for the specific circumstances they now faced, and they were forced to make decisions based on their best judgment under extreme pressure. Some crew members were criticized for their decisions, while others were praised for their courage and leadership, but all were operating in a situation that had no precedent in their experience. The musicians aboard the Titanic, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley, continued to play throughout the evacuation, providing a soundtrack of familiar melodies that helped to calm the passengers and maintain some semblance of normalcy in the face of the disaster. Their decision to remain at their posts, continuing to perform even as the ship settled deeper into the water, became one of the most remembered acts of courage from the disaster. The music they played, ranging from popular tunes to hymns, provided comfort to those who were leaving the ship and those who remained behind. The ship's officers, despite the unprecedented nature of the situation they faced, worked with remarkable professionalism to maintain order and ensure that the evacuation proceeded as smoothly as possible. Their efforts were hampered by the inadequate number of lifeboats, the confusing layout of the ship, and the natural human tendency toward panic in the face of mortal danger. Yet they persevered in their duties, guided by their training and their commitment to the safety of the passengers and crew under their care. Captain Smith, whose long career at sea had prepared him for many emergencies, but nothing quite like this, moved through the ship during the evacuation, offering encouragement to passengers and crew alike. His presence provided reassurance to those who looked to him for leadership, even as he grappled with the terrible reality of what was occurring. The captain's behavior during the disaster, like that of many others aboard the ship, revealed the complexity of human nature under extreme stress. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked frantically to send distress signals to any ships that might be within range to provide assistance. Their efforts, conducted in the small wireless room as the ship gradually settled into the water, represented a lifeline to the outside world and the possibility of rescue. The messages they transmitted, using both the traditional CQD distress signal and the newer SOS code, carried the hope that help might arrive before it was too late. The engineering crew, working in the bowels of the ship where the flooding was most severe, continued their efforts to maintain power and keep the ship afloat as long as possible. Their work, conducted in conditions of extreme danger as the water rose around them, was essential to the evacuation effort. The lights that continued to burn throughout the ship, the power that operated the davits used to lower the lifeboats, and the wireless equipment that sent distress signals, all depended on the heroic efforts of these men who worked, knowing that their own chances of survival were minimal. As the evacuation continued, the social divisions that had characterized the voyage began to break down in some areas while becoming more pronounced in others. Some first-class passengers shared their lifeboat spaces with crew members and passengers from other classes, while others maintained their exclusive attitudes, even in the face of disaster. The crisis revealed both the best and worst aspects of human nature as people responded to the ultimate test of their character and values. The children aboard the ship, many of whom did not fully understand the gravity of the situation, were evacuated with their mothers or other female relatives. The sight of these young passengers, some excited by the adventure, and others frightened by the confusion around them, provided some of the most poignant moments of the evacuation. The crew members who assisted with loading the boats took special care to ensure that children were safely placed and comforted during the terrifying process of being lowered into the dark ocean. The elderly passengers, many of whom had difficulty moving quickly or understanding the urgency of the situation, required special assistance during the evacuation. Some were carried to the lifeboats by crew members or fellow passengers, while others were left behind when they could not be moved quickly enough. The decisions about who could be helped and who had to be left behind were among the most difficult faced by those organizing the evacuation. As the last of the lifeboats was lowered into the water, those who remained on the ship faced the reality that no further rescue was possible from the vessel itself. The deck began to tilt more sharply as the ship's bow settled deeper into the water, and the carefully maintained order of the evacuation began to give way to the desperate scramble of people trying to find any means of survival. The social conventions that had governed behavior throughout the voyage were finally overwhelmed by the primal human instinct for self-preservation. The lifeboats, now floating in the calm waters of the North Atlantic, carried with them a cross-section of humanity that reflected both the diversity of the ship's company and the cruel arithmetic of survival. The occupants of these boats, huddled together against the cold, represented the random nature of who lived and who died in the disaster. Some boats carried mainly first-class passengers, while others held a mixture of people from all levels of society. The common experience of survival would bind these people together in ways that transcended the social divisions that had previously defined their relationships. The tragic irony of the evacuation was that the very features that had made the Titanic the most luxurious ship of her time also contributed to the loss of life when disaster struck. The elaborate class divisions, the complex layout designed to segregate different types of passengers, and the emphasis on social hierarchy all became obstacles to an effective evacuation. The ship that had been designed to showcase the achievements of modern civilization became instead a monument to the limitations of human foresight and the persistence of social inequality, even in the face of mortal danger. Chapter 7. The final moments, as the last of the lifeboats disappeared into the darkness of the North Atlantic night, those who remained aboard the Titanic faced the approaching end with a mixture of resignation, desperation, and quiet dignity that would forever define how the world remembered this tragic night. The great ship, which had carried so many hopes and dreams across the ocean, now settled deeper into the water with each passing minute, her bow disappearing beneath the surface, while her stern rose higher into the star-filled sky. The mathematical certainty of her fate had become undeniable, yet the human drama that unfolded on her decks during these final hours revealed the full spectrum of courage, fear, and grace that resides within the human spirit. The ship's electric lights continued to burn with surprising steadiness, casting their warm glow across the tilting decks and providing an almost surreal contrast to the desperate situation that was unfolding. The power plant, located deep within the vessel and maintained by the heroic efforts of the engineering crew, continued to function even as the water rose around the machinery. This electrical power was more than merely practical necessity. It represented a defiant assertion of human ingenuity and determination in the face of overwhelming natural forces. The lights that illuminated the ship's final moments became symbols of the civilization and technology that had created her, burning bright, even as that same civilization faced its limitations. On the boat deck, where the empty davits stood as silent testimony to the lifeboats that had already been launched, the remaining passengers and crew gathered in small groups, their conversations conducted in hushed tones that seemed appropriate to the solemnity of the situation. The social hierarchies that had defined life aboard the ship during the voyage had largely dissolved in the face of their common fate, replaced by a more fundamental recognition of shared humanity. Wealthy industrialists stood beside immigrant families, ship's officers conversed with third-class passengers, and the artificial barriers that had once seemed so important faded into irrelevance. The musicians, led by bandmaster Wallace Hartley, had assembled near the entrance to the first-class lounge, their instruments creating a pocket of familiar melody in the midst of the surrounding chaos. The music they played served multiple purposes. It provided comfort to those who were facing death. It helped maintain some semblance of order and calm, and it represented a final act of professional dedication that transcended the immediate circumstances. The selection of music evolved throughout the evening, beginning with popular tunes and ragtime melodies that passengers would recognize, then gradually shifting toward more solemn and spiritual compositions as the gravity of the situation became increasingly apparent. The question of what final song the band played has become one of the most debated aspects of the Titanic disaster, with various survivors reporting different melodies. Some remembered hearing "Nearer My God to Thee," a hymn that had long been associated with moments of spiritual crisis and divine supplication. Others recalled different hymns or popular songs of the period. The uncertainty surrounding this detail reflects the chaotic nature of the ship's final moments, when individual perceptions were shaped by personal experiences, emotional states, and the gradual breakdown of normal sensory processing under extreme stress. What remains undisputed is the extraordinary courage demonstrated by Hartley and his fellow musicians, who continued to play even as the deck beneath their feet tilted at increasingly dangerous angles. Their decision to remain at their posts, providing comfort through music rather than seeking whatever slim chances of survival might have remained, embodied the highest ideals of professional duty and human compassion. The image of these men, standing with their instruments as the ship settled into the ocean, became one of the most enduring symbols of the disaster and a testament to the power of art to provide solace in humanity's darkest hours. As the ship's list increased and her bow settled deeper beneath the surface, the physical structure of the vessel began to show signs of the enormous stress being placed upon it. The Titanic had been designed to withstand the normal forces encountered during ocean travel, but the current situation exceeded all parameters considered by her builders. The weight of the water flooding the forward compartments, combined with the buoyancy of the still dry stern sections, created stresses that no ship had ever been designed to endure. The groaning and creaking sounds that emanated from deep within the hull bore witness to the Titanic's struggle between human engineering and natural forces. The passengers who remained on board responded to their situation in ways that revealed the full complexity of human nature under extreme duress. Some gathered in groups, drawing comfort from the presence of others and engaging in quiet conversation or prayer. Others sought solitude, finding private spaces where they could contemplate their fate in whatever manner seemed most appropriate to their personal beliefs and temperament. The ship's libraries and reading rooms, normally places of quiet study and reflection, became sanctuaries for those who sought peaceful surroundings in which to face the approaching end. Captain Edward Smith, whose long career at sea was drawing to a close in circumstances he could never have imagined, moved through the ship during these final hours with the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire professional life. His presence provided reassurance to passengers and crew alike, even though everyone understood that his authority could not alter the fundamental reality of their situation. The captain's behavior during the disaster exemplified the maritime tradition of leadership through personal example, remaining calm and professional even when facing the ultimate test of seamanship. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, continued their desperate attempts to summon assistance from any ships that might be within range. Their small compartment, filled with the continuous chatter of Morse code, represented the ship's final connection to the outside world and the possibility of rescue. Phillips, in particular, worked with almost frantic dedication, sending distress signal after distress signal into the darkness, each transmission carrying the hope that help might arrive before it was too late. The operators' persistence in their duty, maintained even as the ship settled deeper into the water, demonstrated the same professional commitment that characterized so many of the crew's actions during the disaster. The engineering crew, working in the lowest levels of the ship where the flooding was most severe, continued their efforts to maintain power and keep the vessel afloat as long as possible. These men, many of whom had no realistic chance of reaching the upper decks before the ship sank, worked with the knowledge that their efforts were buying precious time for others who might still be saved. The lights that continued to burn, the power that operated essential systems, and the steam that provided heat all depended on the heroic dedication of these crew members who labored in conditions of extreme danger. As the ship's angle increased, the physical act of remaining on deck became increasingly difficult. Passengers and crew found themselves grasping railings, stanchions, and any other fixed objects that could provide stability on the tilting surface. The elegant promenade decks, which had been designed for leisurely strolls and social gatherings, became treacherous slopes where every step required careful consideration. The ship's fine appointments, from deck chairs to potted plants, began to slide and shift as gravity asserted its inexorable influence. The temperature of the North Atlantic water, hovering just above the freezing point, created an additional layer of mortal danger for anyone who might survive the ship's sinking. The crew members who understood the maritime environment knew that exposure to such cold water would be fatal within minutes, making the ocean itself as deadly as the sinking ship. This knowledge influenced many decisions during the final hours, as people weighed the relative risks of remaining aboard the vessel versus entering the frigid water. The ship's dogs, who had been traveling as passengers' companions, presented a particularly poignant aspect of the disaster. Some had been released from their kennels and were seen wandering the decks, their confusion and fear adding another layer of pathos to the unfolding tragedy. The presence of these innocent animals, unable to understand the gravity of the situation, served as a reminder of the broader impact of the disaster on all forms of life aboard the vessel. As the bow of the ship disappeared completely beneath the surface, the remaining portions of the vessel began to experience stresses that exceeded the limits of their structural integrity. The Titanic, despite her advanced design and robust construction, had not been built to withstand the forces created by partial submersion while maintaining buoyancy in other sections. The hull, which had served faithfully throughout the voyage, began to show signs of catastrophic failure as the impossible physics of the situation overwhelmed the strongest materials and most sophisticated engineering of the era. The sound of the ship's structure failing was unlike anything most people had ever heard. The groaning and cracking of steel under extreme stress created an almost musical quality that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. This mechanical symphony, combining the sounds of failing rivets, buckling plates, and separating joints, provided an eerie counterpoint to the human voices and the continuing music of the ship's band. The acoustic environment during these final moments was a complex mixture of human emotion, mechanical failure, and the natural sounds of wind and water. The moment when the ship's structure finally gave way came with surprising suddenness after hours of gradual deterioration. The Titanic, subjected to stresses that no vessel had ever been designed to endure, broke apart between the third and fourth funnels, creating two separate sections that would meet very different fates. The forward section, already largely submerged and weighted down by the flooded compartments, disappeared beneath the surface with relative speed. The stern section, suddenly freed from the weight of the bow, righted itself briefly before beginning its own final descent. The breakup of the ship created a new set of challenges for those who remained on board. Passengers and crew, who had been standing together, found themselves separated by the physical division of the vessel, with some on the bow section as it made its final dive, and others on the stern as it briefly regained some stability. The psychological impact of witnessing the destruction of what had seemed like an indestructible creation of human engineering was profound, forcing everyone to confront the ultimate limitations of technology and human ambition. Those who found themselves on the stern section experienced a brief respite as this portion of the ship stabilized temporarily after the breakup. The deck, which had been tilting at an increasingly dangerous angle, returned to something approaching level, allowing people to regain their footing and gather their thoughts. However, this reprieve was short-lived, as the stern section, lacking the structural integrity of the complete vessel, began to settle into the water with its own inevitable rhythm. The decision of when to leave the ship became an intensely personal calculation for each individual who remained on board. Some chose to enter the water while the ship was still partially afloat, hoping to swim away from the vessel before suction or debris could pose additional dangers. Others remained on deck until the very last moment, whether from fear of the cold water, hope that rescue might still arrive, or simple acceptance of their fate. These individual choices, made under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, reflected the full spectrum of human psychology and the different ways people respond to mortal danger. The process of entering the water was itself a traumatic experience that would haunt survivors for years to come. The shock of the cold water, barely above freezing, created an immediate physiological crisis that few people could survive for more than a few minutes. The human body's response to such extreme cold included involuntary gasping, rapid heart rate, and the swift onset of hypothermia. Those who managed to survive the initial shock found themselves in a desperate struggle against time, knowing that their chances of survival decreased with each passing minute. The sounds that emanated from the water after people began entering it created one of the most disturbing aspects of the disaster. The cries for help, the sounds of people struggling against the cold and the waves, and the gradual diminishment of voices as hypothermia took its toll, created an audio landscape that survivors would never forget. These sounds, carrying across the calm water of the North Atlantic, served as a constant reminder of the human cost of the disaster and the limitations of the rescue efforts. The final moments of the Titanic herself came as the stern section, having briefly stabilized after the breakup, began its own inevitable descent toward the ocean floor. Those who remained on this portion of the ship faced the terrifying experience of feeling the deck beneath their feet angle sharply upward as the stern rose nearly vertical before beginning its final plunge. The sensation of the ship's final dive, with its combination of mechanical sounds, rushing water, and the desperate actions of those still aboard, created an experience that defied description and challenged the limits of human endurance. The ship's lights, which had burned so faithfully throughout the disaster, finally flickered and died as the electrical systems were overwhelmed by the rising water. The sudden transition from the artificial illumination that had provided comfort and visibility to the complete darkness of the North Atlantic night marked a symbolic end to the technological civilization that the Titanic had represented. The stars, which had been visible throughout the night but overshadowed by the ship's electric lights, suddenly became the only source of illumination in the vast emptiness of the ocean. The final disappearance of the Titanic beneath the surface of the North Atlantic occurred at approximately 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, ship's time. The great vessel, which had represented the pinnacle of human engineering and ambition, slipped beneath the waves with a sound that survivors described as both thunderous and eerily quiet. The suction created by the ship's final dive was less than many had feared, allowing some of those in the water to survive the immediate aftermath of the sinking. The silence that followed the ship's disappearance was profound and unsettling. After hours of mechanical sounds, human voices, and the gradual crescendo of the disaster, the sudden quiet seemed almost supernatural. The only sounds that remained were the gentle lapping of waves and the increasingly faint cries of those who struggled in the frigid water. This silence, broken only by the sounds of human suffering, created an atmosphere of desolation that would remain with survivors for the rest of their lives. The ocean, which had seemed so peaceful and accommodating during the voyage, now revealed its true nature as an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. The calm surface that had appeared so benign under the ship's lights now stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no refuge or comfort to those who found themselves at its mercy. The water itself, dark and cold beyond human tolerance, became the final arbiter of who would live and who would die on this tragic night. The transformation of the scene from the bustling activity of a great passenger ship to the empty expanse of dark ocean occurred with shocking finality. Where moments before had stood the largest moving object ever created by human hands, now there was only water, stars, and the scattered debris that marked the site of one of history's most profound disasters. The Titanic, with all her grandeur and promise, had become a memory and a grave, leaving behind only the survivors in the lifeboats and the gradually diminishing voices of those who struggled in the water. The realization that the great ship was truly gone, that the impossible had actually occurred, began to settle over the survivors with the weight of absolute finality. The Titanic, which had seemed so permanent and secure, had proven to be as ephemeral as any other human creation when confronted with the indifferent forces of nature. The disaster had revealed the ultimate limitations of technology, the persistence of social inequality, and the profound capacity for both courage and selfishness that resides within the human heart. As the sounds from the water gradually faded and the survivors in the lifeboats found themselves alone on the vast ocean, the full magnitude of what had occurred began to become apparent. The largest ship in the world had disappeared beneath the waves, taking with it over 1,500 souls and the confidence of an entire era in the power of human ingenuity to overcome the forces of nature. The silence that now surrounded the lifeboats was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of a profound transformation in humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world. Chapter 8, Rescue and Regret. As the first pale rays of dawn began to paint the Atlantic horizon in gentle shades of rose and gold, a single ship's silhouette emerged from the morning mist. The RMS Carpathia, a modest Cunard liner that had been quietly making its way across the ocean just hours before, now carried the weight of an impossible mission. Captain Arthur Rostron had pushed his vessel beyond its normal limits, racing through the night at 17 knots, a speed that seemed to defy the very capabilities of his ship. Yet even this heroic effort would prove insufficient against the cruel mathematics of time and distance. The Carpathia had received the Titanic's distress call at approximately 12:35 in the morning, just as the great ship was beginning to accept its fate. Captain Rostron, awakened by his wireless operator, had immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Without hesitation, he had ordered his ship to change course, turning toward the coordinates that would soon become synonymous with tragedy. The distance between the two vessels was 58 nautical miles, a gap that would take nearly 4 hours to bridge, even at maximum speed. As the Carpathia raced through the darkness, her crew worked with quiet efficiency to prepare for what they hoped would be a rescue operation. Blankets were gathered from storage compartments, hot soup was prepared in the kitchens, and medical supplies were organized in the ship's hospital. The passengers aboard the Carpathia, many of whom had been awakened by the unusual activity and the change in the ship's rhythm, gathered in small groups, whispering prayers and sharing anxious glances. They understood, even without being told the full details, that they were part of something extraordinary and terrible. The night passed slowly for those aboard the Carpathia. Captain Rostron stood on his bridge, watching the stars wheel overhead, calculating and recalculating their arrival time. His officers monitored the ship's engines, listening for any sign of strain as they pushed the vessel harder than it had ever been pushed before. In the wireless room, the operator maintained constant contact with the Titanic, receiving increasingly desperate messages as the situation grew more dire. The last clear transmission from the Titanic came at 1:27 a.m., a brief message that would echo through history. "Come as quickly as possible, old man. The engine room is filling up." When the Carpathia finally reached the coordinates provided by the Titanic's distress calls, the sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. The scene that greeted Captain Rostron and his crew was one of profound solitude and mystery. Where the mighty Titanic should have been, there was only the endless expanse of the Atlantic, its surface broken by scattered debris and the occasional iceberg drifting silently in the distance. The great ship had vanished completely, leaving behind only fragments of its existence scattered across the waves. The lifeboats appeared gradually, like small islands of humanity floating in the vast ocean. The first boat spotted by the Carpathia's lookouts was lifeboat number 2, containing only a handful of survivors. As the rescue ship approached, the crew could see the occupants of the lifeboat huddled together against the morning cold, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and profound trauma. The process of bringing these survivors aboard was conducted with the utmost care and gentleness, as if the crew of the Carpathia understood that they were handling something infinitely precious and fragile. One by one, the lifeboats were located, and their occupants brought aboard the Carpathia. The rescue operation continued throughout the morning, with each boat representing a small miracle of survival against impossible odds. The survivors who climbed aboard the Carpathia were a diverse group, representing all classes of society that had been aboard the Titanic. There were wealthy passengers still wearing their evening clothes, their diamonds and furs now seeming almost absurd in the harsh light of their new reality. There were immigrants who had risked everything for a chance at a new life in America, their few possessions now lost forever beneath the waves. There were crew members who had worked until the very end to save as many lives as possible, their uniforms torn and stained with seawater and oil. The survivors were wrapped in blankets and given hot drinks, but their physical comfort was only a small part of their needs. Many sat in complete silence, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. Others spoke in whispers, recounting fragments of their experiences to anyone who would listen. The women who had been separated from their husbands searched desperately among the other survivors, hoping against hope that their loved ones might have found a place on another boat. The reality of their losses was beginning to sink in, but the full weight of the tragedy would not be felt for days to come. As the morning progressed and the last of the lifeboats was brought alongside the Carpathia, the final tally of survivors became clear. Of the more than 2,200 people who had been aboard the Titanic when it departed from Southampton, only 710 had survived the disaster. The numbers were stark and unforgiving, representing one of the greatest maritime tragedies in history. Women and children had been given priority in the lifeboats, as was the custom of the time, but even this gallant gesture could not mask the terrible arithmetic of insufficient lifeboat capacity. The survivors huddled together on the decks of the Carpathia, wrapped in blankets provided by the crew and passengers of the rescue ship. Many of them were still in shock, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. The wealthy passengers who had boarded the Titanic in their finest clothes now found themselves wearing borrowed garments, their social distinctions rendered meaningless by the democracy of survival. The third-class passengers, who had faced the greatest challenges in reaching the lifeboats, were now treated with the same care and consideration as the first-class passengers, their shared experience of loss, creating a temporary equality that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. As the Carpathia began its journey back to New York, the survivors slowly began to process their experiences. Some wrote letters to family members, trying to explain what had happened in words that seemed inadequate to capture the enormity of the event. Others simply sat in silence, watching the ocean that had claimed so many lives. The ship's chaplain held impromptu services for those who wished to pray, offering what comfort he could to people who had witnessed the unthinkable. The wireless operator aboard the Carpathia found himself at the center of a communications maelstrom. News of the Titanic's sinking had reached the shore, and telegraph offices around the world were desperate for information. The operator worked tirelessly to send lists of survivors to waiting families, each message representing either profound relief or devastating confirmation of loss. The process was slow and methodical, hampered by the limitations of the wireless technology of the time and the sheer volume of information that needed to be transmitted. In New York, crowds began to gather at the offices of the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic. Families who had said goodbye to loved ones just days before now waited in agonizing uncertainty, hoping to see familiar names on the survivor lists. The initial reports were confused and contradictory, with some newspapers reporting that the Titanic was still afloat and being towed to port. As the truth gradually emerged, the crowds grew larger and more desperate, with people clutching photographs of their loved ones and pleading for any scrap of information. The world's press descended upon the story with an intensity that had rarely been seen before. Reporters from every major newspaper tried to piece together the events of that terrible night, interviewing survivors, maritime experts, and anyone else who might provide insight into how such a disaster could have occurred. The story dominated front pages across the globe, with headlines that ranged from factual reporting to sensationalistic speculation. The public's fascination with the tragedy was intense and immediate, driven by a mixture of genuine sympathy for the victims and a morbid curiosity about the details of the disaster. As the Carpathia made its way toward New York Harbor, the survivors aboard began to organize themselves into informal groups. The women who had lost husbands found comfort in each other's company, sharing their grief and trying to make sense of their new circumstances. The crew members who had survived faced the difficult task of explaining their actions during the disaster, knowing that they would be questioned extensively about every decision made during those crucial hours. The passengers who had been traveling in steerage faced the additional challenge of having lost not only their loved ones, but also their dreams of a new life in America. The ship's crew worked tirelessly to care for the survivors, sharing their own quarters and personal belongings with people who had lost everything. The passengers who had originally boarded the Carpathia for a routine Atlantic crossing found themselves part of a historic event, their planned vacation transformed into a mission of mercy. Many of them gave up their own cabins to accommodate the survivors, sleeping in lounges and public areas to ensure that those who had endured such trauma could have some measure of privacy and comfort. As news of the disaster spread around the world, the questions began to multiply. How could the most advanced ship of its time have sunk so quickly? Why were there not enough lifeboats for all the passengers and crew? What had gone wrong with the supposedly unsinkable ship? The maritime community was particularly shaken by the disaster, as it challenged many of the assumptions that had guided ship design and safety protocols for decades. The Titanic had been equipped with the latest in maritime technology, including watertight compartments and sophisticated communication equipment. Yet none of these innovations had been sufficient to prevent the tragedy. The survivors themselves were the best source of information about what had happened during the sinking, but their accounts were often fragmentary and contradictory. The trauma of the experience had affected their memories, and many found it difficult to speak about what they had witnessed. Those who did share their stories painted a picture of both heroism and tragedy, describing acts of selfless courage alongside moments of panic and desperation. The ship's band, which had reportedly played until the very end, became a symbol of dignity in the face of disaster. The officers and crew who had worked to load the lifeboats and maintain order were praised for their professionalism under impossible circumstances. The technical aspects of the disaster began to emerge as maritime experts analyzed the available evidence. The Titanic had struck an iceberg at approximately 11:40 p.m. ship's time, creating a series of punctures along the starboard side of the hull. The design of the ship, with its system of watertight compartments, should have been able to withstand such damage, but the particular pattern of the collision had compromised too many compartments simultaneously. The ship had been traveling at nearly full speed despite warnings about ice in the area, a decision that would be scrutinized for decades to come. The role of other ships in the vicinity also became a subject of intense investigation. The Californian, a cargo ship that had been trapped in ice about 19 miles from the Titanic's position, had seen mysterious lights on the horizon during the night of the disaster. The crew of the Californian had observed what appeared to be rocket signals, but had not recognized them as distress calls. This failure to respond would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire tragedy, raising questions about maritime communication protocols and the responsibilities of ships to aid vessels in distress. As the Carpathia approached New York Harbor on the evening of April 18, 1912, the city prepared for their arrival. Thousands of people lined the docks, creating a sea of faces in the gathering darkness. The ship's arrival was delayed by a thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the dark mood of the occasion. When the Carpathia finally docked at Pier 54, the survivors disembarked into a world that had been forever changed by their experience. The fortunate ones were met by relieved family members who had spent days in agonizing uncertainty. Others faced the terrible task of beginning new lives, without the loved ones who had shared their dreams of America. The immediate aftermath of the disaster was marked by a mixture of grief, anger, and determination to understand what had gone wrong. Memorial services were held in cities around the world, honoring the memory of those who had perished in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The survivors found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight, their every word scrutinized by reporters and investigators seeking to understand the events of that terrible night. Many of them struggled with what would later be recognized as survivors' guilt, questioning why they had been spared when so many others had not. The maritime industry faced a crisis of confidence that would lead to sweeping changes in ship design and safety regulations. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, which had been established in 1914 in direct response to the Titanic disaster, would fundamentally alter how ships were built and operated. The requirement for sufficient lifeboats to accommodate all passengers and crew, which seemed so obvious in retrospect, became a universal standard that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. The story of the Titanic's sinking became more than just a maritime disaster. It became a symbol of humanity's relationship with technology and nature. The ship that had been promoted as unsinkable had proven to be tragically vulnerable, reminding the world that no human creation could completely overcome the forces of nature. The disaster also highlighted the social inequalities of the time, as the survival rates varied dramatically between the different classes of passengers. These disparities would fuel discussions about social justice and equality that would continue long after the last survivor had told their story. As the years passed, the Titanic would become the subject of countless books, films, and documentaries, each trying to capture the essence of that terrible night. The survivors, those who lived long enough to share their memories, would find themselves serving as living links to a tragedy that had captured the world's imagination. Their stories, told and retold over the decades, would ensure that the lessons of the Titanic would not be forgotten, even as the physical evidence of the disaster lay hidden beneath 2.5 miles of ocean water. The rescue by the Carpathia represented both the end of the immediate crisis and the beginning of a longer process of healing and understanding. The ship that had raced through the night to save lives became a symbol of human compassion and determination. Its crew honored for their efforts, even as the world mourned those who could not be saved. The image of 710 survivors huddled in blankets on the deck of the rescue ship would become one of the most enduring symbols of the tragedy, representing both the scale of the loss and the precious nature of the lives that had been saved. The questions that began to emerge in the immediate aftermath of the disaster would continue to resonate for generations to come. How could such a tragedy have been prevented? What lessons could be learned from the mistakes that had been made? How could the maritime industry ensure that such a disaster would never happen again? These questions would drive investigations, reforms and innovations that would make ocean travel safer for all who followed in the wake of the Titanic. In the quiet moments between the drama of the rescue and the intensity of the investigations that would follow, the survivors of the Titanic faced the most difficult challenge of all, learning to live with the memory of what they had experienced. The gentle rocking of the Carpathia as it carried them towards safety would remain in their memories forever, a reminder of both the fragility of life and the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable loss.